So good morning. I'm delighted today to receive for Equality Imperative one of the biggest LGBT leaders in the world, David Mixner. Let me take this opportunity to thank Out Leadership global sponsors, RBC Capital Markets, Greenberg Traurig, EY, HSBC, and Robes and Gray. So it's a great honor to have you with us, David. I have your book prominently displayed here. I have been a big admirer of your work across the years. So my first question to you, David, is that I know that you've been confined in your apartment in New York City for quite a while now. So how are you feeling?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. And Fabrice, as you know, you're one of my heroes, and I'm here because of you today. The work you did at the UN and everywhere else has been an inspiration to so many of us. I'm very grateful that you extended the invitation. How am I doing? I've been in an apartment by myself since March 9th. And I'm doing good. You know, I've been ill with some other diseases. So I'm sort of like a buffet for the zombie virus. So I have to be very careful. But I'm doing fine, you know. I mean, very little has been asked of our generation in so many ways. Other generations at 18 years old had to fight in World War II or Vietnam, and all they're asking us is to wear a mask and lock down and watch television. I mean, I'm amazed at people who are having a hard time with this because our country has called upon us to do so much more in sacrifices in the past.
So David, you have been an organizer for 60 years in politics and civil rights. You have been in the anti-war movement. You have worked to save wildlife in Africa. So you have had an extensive experience of what has shaped the United States across the years. We are today at a very peculiar moment. There has been tremendous riots in the United States in the past few days. So, you know, are you hopeful about the situation? What has been your reaction to the riots against racial violence that are taking place?
First of all, there are no riots. There are protests. And, you know, I have been involved in the anti-war protests. I was involved in the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. I've been in jail. I've been beaten by the police. And I've always have lived long enough to see that those actions was worthwhile. That good comes out of when the public checks its government and its institutions, because that's what we're supposed to do in a democracy. And whether it was shortening the Vietnam War, that we didn't end it, we shortened it and we stopped nuclear weapons from being used there, or the sacrifices made by young African Americans in the civil rights movement in the 60s. We got the voting rights bill and the public accommodations bill. The really exciting part about these protests that makes it more unique than most is that it's everyone involved, that it's not just an African-American protest, it is a protest of all races, all creeds, all religions, people coming together and saying, this is unacceptable. I mean, who can ever watch that video of George Floyd and not know that what happened was wrong? And I just, excuse me, I had to get rid of the cat there. It was one of the most horrifying videos I've ever seen in my experience. And so what is interesting to me, that despite the difficulties of the night before last, when our leadership wasn't prepared to exert the kind of thoughtful and appropriate monitoring of people looting, last night, they will double the number of marchers. There were 60,000 in Houston and 20,000 in Portland and overseas. So this is, I think, the world saying after 3 years, not only was George Floyd the last straw. I think a great deal of it also has to do is that we don't want this kind of America anymore. We don't want this kind of division. We don't want this kind of anger. We don't want this kind of slaughter in our streets of young African Americans. We are better than that, and we're rejecting that. And I find it very hopeful. I think the protests have been very peaceful compared to protests in the past. I remember after Dr. King was assassinated in Washington, D.C., that literally entire city blocks were burned down. There's been very little burning buildings with the possible exception of Minneapolis. I'm very proud of the protesters. I'm very proud of our country right now. And I'm very hopeful that we can take that energy and replace the President of the United States in November.
So, I was thinking yesterday that indeed, we saw a lot of pushback in front of the White House. We did see police violence, and I was thinking yesterday that you actually experienced police violence against yourself in 1968, and then you were carted off to jail from a protest at the White House. So could you tell us those two stories?
I have been beaten by the police 3 times brutally in demonstrations, and in jail 15 times. Maybe I have a thing for handcuffs, I'm not sure. But it's horrifying what happens. I mean, when there is a police riot, which is what we saw the night before last when they cleared the streets in Washington, peaceful protesters so that the president could get a photo op.
I love that your cat is really insisting to be part of the podcast. I think she should be allowed. She definitely should be allowed. She's very pretty.
But thank you. I won't tell her that because she'll be back for more. In 1968 at the Democratic Convention, around the war, and also the Poor People's Campaign led by Dr. King to deal with income inequality in America. I was caught up in a demonstration outside the headquarters of the Hubert Humphrey campaign in Eugene McCarthy, the Hilton Hotel. And police had been incited by the leadership, like Trump. Only this time it was Mayor Daley and some others. And they formed a corral around us and took their batons, removed their badges, and just started beating so that we had no escape. And I was beaten on my leg for over an hour. And I was on crutches for 3 years, off and on, in therapy. And then they wouldn't let medical aid in. But you know what? We won. We won. We brought the attention of the nation to the injustice. And it's a hard way to win. We did not respond in violence, which even made the message even greater. Listen, I mean, America saw peaceful protesters the night before last attacked by people on horses, tear gas, mace, pepper spray, and billy clubs and shields, so the President of the United States could hold up a Bible upside down in front of a church. And that reminded me a great deal of Chicago. Well, what is the same thing that happened in Chicago, it was televised. And people saw how outrageous it was and what happened to those poor demonstrators. And I think it backfired on them dramatically. The fact of the matter is, my experience with the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, anti-war movement, gay rights, AIDS rights, is in the end, sometimes not as fast as they should. The American people do the right thing.
But David, we have seen a lot of protests against racial violence, across the years. Do you feel that there is something different this time, or do you feel that this is not going to be?
I'll tell you what's different that I haven't seen since the 1960s, and that is we have public officials, Trump, McConnell, people like that, giving racists permission to come out of the closet with their racism. And praising people like there's some good people on that side when Nazis march in Charlottesville. That's different. We used to only see that in the deep South. But now we have the President of the United States literally giving people permission to express their racial hatred, to make it a badge of honor, to carry Confederate flags to his rallies, to chant inappropriate things. That is different. And it has taken the American people longer than I want to respond to that opening of racism, blatant racism again in society. But then inevitably in history, I mean, you have to have the patience of Gandhi and the wisdom of King. Inevitably in history, not on our time, but in the time of history, something happens, whether it's 4 students being shot dead at Kent State during the anti-war protest, 2 African-American students shot at the same time at Jackson State. There is a moment that there is something that is visible and outrageous that sort of clarifies people's thinkings. You would hope that it wouldn't take a George Foster or 4 dying at Kent State University or, you know, mass roundup of immigrants and people. We forget we still have people in concentration camps on the border in unsafe, unhealthy conditions. And we've all accepted it almost as a norm. And they're still there in cages along our border. But it's invisible. And until it's made visible, we're going to have a problem with that. So what I think has happened, and it's probably the greatest, only good that can honor Mr. Floyd, is that his death has awakened a nation to the horrendous attitude of racism and hatred and division of the last 3 years of this presidency that has been historically, for the last couple of decades, inappropriate to be a racist, inappropriate to be an anti-Semite, inappropriate to be so openly anti-LGBTQ. And now they have said to him, it's appropriate. Go ahead, be a racist. You know, bring your Confederate flags to our rallies. And now the American people, in decision makers and religious leaders, and even people in Trump's old administration who are resigning and contradicting him for the first time, said, no, this is not who we are. This is not who we are. This is not who we want to be. This is not the country we want to bring our children in. This is not the division, the violence, the strife that we want. And I think that this was a turning point for the American people having to look at themselves.
Oh, I don't know why, but I cannot hear you anymore, David. Yeah, I still cannot hear you. As if your microphone turned off. Wait, oh, you're muted. You're muted. Okay, I'm going to unmute you. Wait. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So,
but David, a question I have for you is that COVID-19 has placed us in what is a pretty terrible economic crisis. And as you know, during time of economic crisis, you know, nationalism, xenophobia, and racism and homophobia tend to be kind of emboldened. Aren't you afraid that it's going to be difficult to keep our commitment to human rights in a context where people are going to be very fearful about economic security, about their jobs, about their future? And what can, as someone that has the experience of keeping committed to human rights despite external circumstances, what can we do to ensure?
Oh, I think, Fabrice, in answer to your question, that depends on us, doesn't it? You know, we always look, and I think part of the problem the last 3 years, we always look for someone else to fix it for us. The Democratic Party, why isn't so-and-so doing this, and why this organization isn't doing that? And what we've learned is that change comes through us, and politicians respond to us. You know, and when you have a society where 74% of Americans in a poll this week said the country is going in the wrong direction, that means they're ready for change. And so we have to find a way to communicate and make room for them in our movement, make them feel comfortable with the change we're advocating, and make that change. And it's up to the young people of this country who want a future, who want jobs, who want someone who won't let their fellow Americans die by the tens of thousands unnecessarily, and then lie about it. If they don't want that, then they're going to have to work our asses off between now and November. And the contrast between Joe Biden and Trump couldn't be more clear in the last couple of days. And so we have got to stop wringing our hands. It solves nothing. Depression or feeling hopeless is the food for dictators. And so we must lead with a vision and hope. If we lead with despair and hopelessness, people are not going to respond to our vision for change. So it's up to us. It's up to us as citizens to not wait for someone else to do it. That's what's so wonderful about these protests. We're not talking about 500 gathering outside the federal building. We're talking about 60,000 in Houston yesterday. Houston, Texas, 60,000 peacefully saying, this isn't the America we signed up for. So we have to present a vision that we can give jobs, that we can rebuild America, we can take care and make our dams safe and high-speed rail, and that we can put America back to work, that we can make education again affordable and revamp and reform education. It's just not saying the word education. Everyone knows it's not working now. We're 17th in the world from #1. That we can deal with racism, and that we will empower African Americans through the next administration in positions of great responsibility, hopefully as vice president, to once again give hope and a vision for the future, that we can put it back to work, and we can put it, deal with pandemics in a logical and safe way, and save tens of thousands of lives that could have been saved. There's probably 30 to 40,000 people that didn't have to die in this pandemic so far. And they're still not doing anything. They're still pretending it doesn't exist.
And it affects disproportionately racial minorities in the United States.
But it's always easy to wring our hands and say, oh, woe is us. We are not the victims in this. We are not victims. We are citizens demanding a different vision for America that includes all people at every level. We're demanding a system where police officers who are bullied and have constantly held on to their job because of some ridiculous code in the police department that we don't get rid of our own, that they should never get the job, and never two, with the first serious complaint, been dismissed from the force. There is no room. Every institution, whether it's the military, the police, religion, the farmers organizations, have bad apples, has rotten apples among them. And it is up to the people who belong to them, it's up to those who supervise them to sort them out and not allow them to get in our way of a better America.
So David,
otherwise I don't have an opinion for Bruce.
So David, you have been in the civil rights movement and you have been in the LGBT rights movement. You know, one of the questions that of course is coming up for us in the past 3 days is how do the two movements, interconnect? And in your opinion, how can the two reinforce each other? Do you have any suggestions on what the LGBT movement could do better to address racism in the United States?
There is nothing more important for any American citizen in the next 5 months than defeating Donald Trump if we want our democracy. If we love our democracy, if we love our country, if we want to even have a chance at ending racism, if we want to regain our rights from all of the executive orders that Donald Trump has taken LGBT rights, the only thing we should be focusing on as citizens, not as constituencies, is removing Donald Trump from the office of President of the United States. And I can't urge people to vote early, vote and get out there and do what is necessary to make that happen. And it's 5 months. And actually it's lower than that. It's 2.5 months before people actually begin voting on September 16th in Montana, 18th in Montana, through absentee ballots. So we've got to register our people. Shame on the person who doesn't give 100% between now and November. They are telling us they don't care about me and you or anyone else. They are telling us that they don't care about our democracy and our Constitution. And they're telling us that they are greedy and self-centered and selfish. And I don't want those people in my life.
David, one of my questions will be, do you believe that Trump has taken a big hit from his response to the pandemic and from his current response to the racial protest? Or do you think that, in fact, it's his strategy to tap into his constituency by responding in the way he did?
I think without question he's taken a big hit. And someone said, well, he always has gotten away with everything. And there's some truth to that, with the Mueller report and the Ukraine situation. But there's one big difference. There weren't visible moments where you saw the wrongdoing. You just heard the charges. With the pandemic, people saw grandma and grandpa die. We saw our friends die. We saw our relatives die. And then we saw a president who said it doesn't exist. They saw it firsthand, his coldness and calculated, narcissistic way of governing. It was visible. It was real. Let me tell you something. When you have as many people die in 3 months that had died in all of World War I, American soldiers in World War I, it's impossible for that not to have the impact on the psyche of a nation. If you see our streets and our cities filled with protesters, it is impossible not to want this. And we are in a depression right now. We could hit 20, 30% unemployment soon. And people are without work, they're without jobs, and they're worried about how to feed their kids, how to pay their rent, where are they going to get the money. And there's no moral leadership. There is no vision being offered from the White House, except a man saying, I am so good. I am the most magnificent thing that's ever said in the White House. I am the brightest. I am the smartest. You should all be thanking me every day. First of all, he's our servant. He works for us. We don't owe him anything. He owes us the ability to govern this nation with wisdom and strength. Now, I've been through, I think, 9 presidents since Harry Truman. I'm not sure if someone else can count for me. And I've had a lot of presidents that I disagreed with. I've had a lot of presidents that I very strongly disagreed with. But never once in all of my 60 years of organizing did I fear that our democracy truly was at stake, that we could move into a dictatorship, that we could move into something that none of us ever thought was possible in this country. And I believe that today with all my heart, and never once in those 60 years of organizing did I believe that our Constitution was at stake on the ballot.
So David, you mentioned that the biggest risk that we have is complacency and defeatism. We spoke a lot about racial inequalities, of course, because of the current situation. But we wanted, in this conversation to also get your view on what is the future for the LGBT community. You came out in 1976. It was a complete different time. And in many ways, I assume you did not expect to see that much change in your lifetime. When you live in New York City, where the situation for LGBT people has changed tremendously, sometimes you hear people, that feel that we have achieved, everything we could.
It's being taken away from us now.
And it is, that's a very good point.
Being taken away from us, but we're not paying attention, because every time he chips away at our freedom, he does something else equally as outrageous. And it's just, but he has signed dozens of executive orders removing our rights. He has removed transgender people from the military. He is repealed every agency's protection for LGBTQ people in the federal government. This is not a question of protecting what we have. We're losing what we have. Yes, I have never thought I'd see the day where members of my community can get married and have children. But we have to be reminded that the Republicans in Tennessee and in Kansas now have passed laws against us adopting children. And they did it with hardly a peep from us. Because when you become comfortable in your own world, you have a tendency to believe the whole world's like that. When you have enough food on the table and you say grace over that food and give thanks for having enough food on the table, you have to remember that 14% of the American children, that might be much higher now, go to bed hungry every single night. Almost 1 out of every 5, 1 out of every 6 children in America go hungry. That the mortality rate for African American mothers in African American communities is childbirth is greater than in many nations in Africa. We have let our concern for others, our self-righteousness, take us to places that's inappropriate. I'm amazed that people who self-righteously proclaim this is the truth, and I'm talking about our side in the community. This is the only way, and that person's a fascist, and this person doesn't belong here, and that person isn't strong enough, or that person came out too late. That's not the purpose of a movement, to set in judgment and shame others. The purpose of a movement is to change minds and create a space where the people who we have reached with our logic and our wisdom and our love to feel comfortable to join us in creating change.
Well, I love the fact that you talk about changing attitudes and changing hearts and minds. I have had the privilege to see the 3 shows that you made in the past 3 years, and they benefited the California Center, which provides support to young adults that have been and kids that have been kicked out of their homes because of homophobia and transphobia. In your opinion, what is going to change what it is to grow up gay? Because I think that you and I have that same experience, that it was very difficult to grow up gay in a homophobic society. And it still remains a bit the same. A lot of children still have to lie to their parents and lie to their teachers and lie to their priests. How do you think we will get to a situation where young LGBT people don't have to carry that burden of shame and secrecy and also get kicked out of their home?
I've always used the Jewish community as a model. You know, what they have learned through their long history, many of it filled with death and tears and devastation, that you can't take your freedoms and your ability to freely operate in a society ever for granted. You have to always be prepared for the next wave of anti-Semitism, the next wave of programs wherever they might be in the world. We can never take our freedom for granted. They will always be demagogues. They will be people who hate, who desire power, that will try to use our role in society, in the leadership of this country and around the world, as a way to obtain that power for building hatred and distrust between us and the rest of America. We can never allow that to happen. We can never let our guard down. We can never assume that you're married and have 2 kids in a nice house, that someday that will change. And many people who are LGBTQ are out of work right now. Let us not forget that. This isn't someone in West Virginia out of work. This is in New York. A lot of professionals, a lot of mid-level workers are out of work. And, you know, we should be making sure that they're being taken care of. Listen, I mean, I got in this 60 years ago for one reason. I started in 1959 working for John Kennedy as a volunteer. I got into it because John Kennedy and Pope John the 23rd said it was our obligation as human beings to spend our lives helping others. And that was the richest possible life one could live. That was true wealth. And I have done that for 60 years, and they were absolutely right. You know, if any of you have marched in the streets in the last week, you know the feeling you felt. You know the empowerment you felt. Don't lose it. Don't give it up to anybody again, and don't become lazy.
Well, you know, I love the fact that you're talking about your a life of activism. Being an activist is also not very easy. As you mentioned to me, sometimes over lunch, you don't become rich being an activist. And then the other thing is that it's also a lot of heartbreak because you do take personally, you know, some of the development. And I particularly remember the controversy around the don't ask, don't tell policy. And so reflecting back on your life, first of all, do you feel that it was worth it? And also, do you think that a life of activism is a life well lived?
I wouldn't change anything. And I've had a lot of ups and downs. I've had people carry me on their shoulders and call me Moses and tell me I'm the greatest thing since apple pie. And then I've had something happen and they drop me like a hot rock to the ground. And that teaches me to be humble. It teaches me that this is not about myself. It teaches me that that there only is, well, I'll show you several of the lessons in 60 years. Don't confuse issues with values and principles. You know, I always say truth changes every day. You do not know the truth. Today, when I woke up, I will get information today that will change something that I viewed as the truth and create some uncertainty about it, because knowledge changes truth. That's why education is so important. Hell, when I was growing up, I was told there were only 9 planets, and now one of them isn't even a planet, and there's evidently a billion solar systems out there. Truth changes with knowledge. The second thing I learned is know your values and principles. You know, racism has no role in my life. Love is everything. Taking care of your neighbor is a value and principle. Don't confuse them with issues. Those should never, ever change. Your values and principles should be in cement, where you can be willing to have an open mind and look at issues differently every day to see how you can make the world better, maybe with a minor compromise, or maybe by marching in the streets and being tough. So values and principles are different from issues, and issues change all the time. The other thing is self-righteousness is a killer. If you insist on being praised for your knowledge, if you insist on being praised for your leadership because you're right, then you're not going to last long. You're going to be inevitably disappointed. None of us have the answers. What we do is have the ability and our principles and values to create change when we see situations that call us to duty. And the third thing I always say is, why waste your time if you're going to judge and shame people who are late coming to the movement? You know, I saw George W. Bush, who I probably was a president I couldn't have disagreed with more, issue a wise, thoughtful, loving statement this week about the protest and the protesters. Now, I have two choices. I can say, he's an asshole and I've never liked him, da, 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 da. Or I can say, isn't it wonderful that we have come to a place where we have opened his mind to the world we live in? I choose the second.
Well, you know, David, that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is the legacy of Larry Kramer. So, of course, you've known Larry very well, and you know, your health activism and his health activism took place at the same time. You know, he was definitely one of the figures of our community, and it's a gigantic loss for us. Of course, I would love to hear your anecdotes about Larry, your thoughts about, you know, his legacy, because there is a bit of a discussion on whether, you know, his anger was useful or at times was hurtful. And, you know, and also the stories of how the two of you interacted over the years.
Larry and I were friends, and perhaps I'm one of the few friends that that he never broke up with and made up with and broke up with and made up with. We always got along because we knew that we were coming from polar opposites. And we used to have the best conversations. A brilliant man, an extraordinary writer. I was so jealous of how good of a writer he was. And he saved tens of thousands of lives through his approach. He forced America to deal with HIV and AIDS when they didn't want to. And by his anger, which was his tool, people like myself and him and I used to talk about it. I could be the good cop, and candidates would come to me and say, can't you do something about Larry Kramer? And I said, I don't want to do anything about Larry Kramer. What can you do about HIV? That will do more than anything to move us forward. So he played an extremely important role. I don't want his role of activism, which saved thousands of lives. No question about it. He was a leader. He was one that was willing to jeopardize his career, his name, for what he believed in and his values and principles. I have nothing but admiration for him. We certainly disagreed at times on tactics, but he was an unshakable voice for this community. And I hope that also in this time of mourning his death, that we don't forget what an extraordinary talent and creative person he was as a writer. One of the best writers, not in the gay community, but in society. And he took that pen and probably changed, interesting enough, more minds through his art than he did through his anger. With No More Heart and all of his extraordinary works, brought mainstream America into the theater to see our story. And in many ways, I think that helped change as much minds as some of his other activities. But this community should feel nothing but gratitude, and that if they knew him or met him, that they met a person of greatness.
So David, you know, as you know, Larry Kramer passed, and as you mentioned, it's a big loss for us. We also lost Terrence McNally, of COVID-19. We lost Phyllis Lyons. And as you know, better than anybody, we don't have a lot of leaders in our community that survived the AIDS epidemic. Some of us are still here, but a lot of them died during the epidemic. One of the things
and more will. The pandemic is not over.
That's true. That's
by
true.
far.
And one of the things that Larry Kramer always talk about is that LGBT people tend to forget their history, and that they forget their experience of discrimination and the horror of the AIDS epidemic, because they don't really want to look back at what was their situation 40 or 50 years ago. How do you think that we can create that sense of intergenerational community, and also kind of trigger interest in our history? Because one of the things that you mentioned today, David, is that we should never take for granted the progress we have achieved. And in order not to take it for granted, we sometimes have to look at the past and at what happened to us during the epidemic, but also where we were in the 50s, living in the shadows. How do you think that our organizations, our community can do better at keeping its history alive?
Well, I feel in this pandemic, with the death of Terrence and Larry and others, lots of others of our pioneers in the community, many whose names you'll never know, but who changed the world. I feel very strongly that I'm like almost the last one here. That I should shut the lights off and let the next generation take over. And it's a strange feeling, quite honestly. And it's a very real feeling that I'm dealing with. And it's something, just a personal struggle I have to have. But one of the things that united Larry and I very strongly was the critical role of LGBTQ people knowing their history. And here's why. We have an extraordinary history of courageous and noble people, some who a week before their death were getting arrested to protest AIDS. We have people who went to jail in the 50s. We have people in one hospital in California in the 50s where 4,000 lobotomies were performed on LGBTQ people who lost the ability to think for the rest of their lives, put there by their families. We have the 32 people who died in the fire in New Orleans, or the dozens of churches who were firebombed, MCC churches that were firebombed. Thousands who were purged from serving their country in the McCarthy era, and also in Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where 14,000 people were denied the right to serve their country. We have people around the world receiving death penalties and being beaten and burned alive because they're LGBTQ. We should all know this because knowledge is important, and it helps us not taking it for granted. But here's why history is important. If we know about all of the heroes who stood up to Joe McCarthy, or stood up to the lobotomies, who came out early, who showed courage beyond courage, who showed nobility, that we watched, we would have Saturday funerals and Saturday night disco. If we look at the heroics of those people during the AIDS epidemic and how aspiring they were, and that we never became victims, and we took care of our own, and not one person was allowed to die alone because we would not tolerate it and their families wouldn't be there. If you think you come out of nothing, and if you just were placed here on the earth and you can get married and kids, and that you have no history of such a distinguished history that we have, then you are nothing. But if you understand that you come out of something that's extraordinary, filled with stories of courage and heroism bravery and arts and books and literature, then you have a sense of pride of what you come out of. Then you are something, and you have something to pass on to your children. A sense of, we are a special people. We are people who responded to some of the darkest days in history and came out as people of love and caring and marching in the streets by our African American brothers this week.
So David, if you were to meet a young gay man today, and,
don't talk that. I've been alone for 90 days. Be careful.
That's true. That's true. But if a young gay man, which I'm sure happens regularly, come and visit you, which would be the 3 books you would recommend him to learn about his community?
3 books. Well, I'm going to remove my own out of self-interest and be
right there. Stranger Among Friends being a mandatory reading.
I think And the Band Played On by Randy Siltz is a must read. I think that that's an interesting question. I've read so much. I think Paul Manette's book on Becoming a Man.
Becoming a Man
is a very, very good book. And I think I would read some of the poetry of Audre Lorde.
Wow. Okay, great. Well, I'll write that down to recommend to young gay people. We have spoken a lot about being LGBT in the United States and the progress that has been achieved and where we go from here. Right before you entered your quarantine, you were in the Maghreb for a trip, and do you think we are going to see in our lifetime change in places where homosexuality is criminalized, or in places where hearts and minds are far from accepting LGBTI people? And how do you think that the United States can play a role in contributing to social change in places?
Well, we saw how the United States can play a role under Barack Obama and Gordon Brown. Like when Uganda was getting ready to do the death penalty, both the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of England called the President of Uganda and said, no, you don't, and the legislation was killed. We can change minds with the clever use of foreign aid, culture exchanges, all sorts of things that a government of the people and by the people and for the people can do by helping people. I mean, imagine if the State Department sponsored culture exchanges involving gay people with nations, where they would meet and change minds. It's always been a very successful way to do things. If you see a gay person and spend time with a gay person, it's generally hard to not like them. But in answer to your question, how do we think with such enormous odds against us around the world, we dare not think we can change it. The worst thing we can do is believe we can't change it, that it's hopeless. The moment we say it's hopeless or there's not much we can do and we lack the creativity when one door is shut to open another, is the moment we doom those people to death. We have to believe, as we did here in the United States the last 50 years. When I grew up, people were having lobotomies performed. We would come out of a gay bar and they'd pull us over, and it wasn't stop and frisk, it was stop and give a ticket. I come from a time where I was beaten and put on crutches for 3 years. I come from a time where firebombs killed dozens in a bar. That hate crimes against LGBT people, dear, dear friend of mine, one of the brightest people I knew, lost his capacity to think from a baseball bat. So it would have been easy for us to be very pessimistic. We were against the law. We weren't allowed to have public accommodations, all sorts of things. And we must believe, not for ourselves, but for future generations and those who don't have a voice, that we can create change, and we must articulate that vision And we must articulate that determination to be free. And we must never, ever negotiate our freedom to make someone else feel more comfortable so they like us.
Yeah, and I think you're making a very good point by pointing out that the United States used to play a key role in trying to contribute to social change abroad. And when I was at the United Nations in 2016, Ambassador Samantha Power would bring foreign ambassadors like the ambassador of Pakistan to Broadway to show them Rent so that they would understand our life experience.
Exactly.
You know, that,
it's those small
that
acts that
administration,
change the world.
yeah, that administration would never take any step.
So, I mean, we have to have a hope, and we have to articulate it, but we have to present it in a way that people will listen. If we present it with too much anger and our own victimhood or our own hate-filled language, they're not going to listen to us. We're going to play into their image of us. We must never let someone else define who we are, which is an extraordinary community coming out of the AIDS epidemic of love and help and caring for thy neighbor. We must never allow a politician that we want to like and be invited to their house for dinner to say, well, I can't vote with you on this one. You know, will you let me not vote for your freedom? We have to say, no, you have to vote for our freedom. And yes, you'll probably pay a price, but isn't that what we expect from those in leadership? That they do the right thing? I mean, I have seen too many gay people, in order to be liked, negotiate our freedom away. Oh, you don't have to do this, or you don't have to do that. We understand that you'll pay a price. Well, guess what? Those 4,000 people who had lobotomies paid a price. And they have no voice.
So Devin, you mentioned at this point that you are one of the last voices of your generation. Unfortunately, you know, you've been working a lot in the past few years. You have produced many books. You have produced many shows. You have also wrote a lot of opinion pieces in which you denounced the current administration. As you say, the next 6 months are going to be pretty crucial. What are you working on? What do you plan to do to try to support the Biden campaign? Basically, how are you using your confined time lately?
Well, you know, I've been very sick myself, not with COVID, but I've had 11 surgeries and 8 stays in intensive care. My body's pretty tired, pretty weary. But as I said, my voice is still strong. And though it's difficult for me to write as much as I used to write because I have trouble focusing with my illness, I'm very active on social media, putting things in about Biden, like his speech yesterday, urging people to read it. And hopefully, you know, I have a lot of followers on my page and Twitter and Instagram, and I hope that I can reach them by posting things that they might not find on their own and that they take the time. I still am writing some things. I write for Toll Road every once in a while, and then that sort of gets picked up and passed around. I will do everything I can with the energy level I have left and the time I have left, which is limited. However, if I can say one thing, someone said, what do you want on your tombstone? Well, first of all, I don't want a tombstone. I'd say, it's your turn.
Well, David, I cannot thank you enough for having joined us today. It really meant a lot to us. You know, we love your work. I can't wait to see you again in some rooms in New York City. And thank you a lot for a message that was actually very hopeful and very optimistic about the future, and also a call to not be complacent about the current situation. And you know, it really meant a lot.
Let me just say one thing in closing, Fabrice. I want to thank all of those who are listening for treating me so well over the years. Sometimes people had doubts about what I was doing, and sometimes I made mistakes. But the community has looked after me, and they continue to look after me, and I'm very, very grateful. Yes, I've been alone here in this apartment for 90 days because of the pandemic, but I haven't been alone. friends from all over the world have done FaceTime, and I've gotten notes and encouragement. And I am so proud and so honored to be a part of this community. It is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me.
Well, that's a great message. Thank you so much, David. I cannot thank you enough for spending an hour with us. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Ciao.
Love you.
Bye.